So imagine a visionary tech founder in Silicon Valley today, like someone who have a primary angel investor who's backed them from day one.
Right, basically adopting them into this world of immense wealth and, elite connections.
Exactly. And this founder builds their entire life, their whole product roadmap, assuming this multi-million-dollar funding is entirely secure.
Because why wouldn't they? Right.
Right. But then, right before the product launches, the investor suddenly and maliciously just pulls every single dime,
Oh, wow. So they're just left with nothing.
completely stranded. They're forced to bootstrap their way through an incredibly brutal, unforgiving market with absolutely zero safety net.
Yeah, relying on aggressive PR stunts and cutthroat marketing just to, afford their next meal.
Exactly that. Now take that modern tech founder and swap them out for the guy who wrote The Raven.
It really shatters the whole illusion we have of the tortured, otherworldly artist, doesn't it?
It totally does. I mean, when you frame it that way, you strip away the Gothic cobwebs and see the ruthless pragmatism underneath.
Which is exactly what we're going to do today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us, you likely already know the basic Edgar Allan Poe trivia.
Right, the stuff everyone learns in high school.
Yeah, he was orphaned young. He married his much younger cousin, Virginia. He struggled with poverty.
Alcohol, obviously.
Right, and that he practically invented the modern horror story before dying under very mysterious circumstances in Baltimore. But we are not here to read you a Wikipedia timeline today.
No, definitely not.
Our mission for this deep dive is to take everything you thought you knew about the master of the macabre, dismantle it entirely, and meticulously rebuild it.
Using some genuinely fascinating academic research, we have an exceptional stack of sources to guide us today.
We really do. What are we looking at?
Well, we're pulling heavily from historical biographies by Kevin J. Hayes and J. Gerald Kennedy. These texts really strip away the 19th century gossip.
To get to the actual financial mechanics of his life, right?
Exactly. We're also diving into some incredibly dense stylistic and rhetorical analyses of Poe's prose, some phenomenological studies of his poetry.
Which sounds intimidating, but we'll break it down into really simple language.
We will. And we're also looking at a truly eye-opening text by Jonathan H. Hartman regarding the literal marketing of Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Setting the stage here. When we say Edgar Allan Poe, the image in your head is usually like a guy brooding in a graveyard.
Right, just waiting for divine, miserable inspiration to strike him from the heavens.
Exactly. But to actually understand why Poe wrote the way he did and why he engineered those terrifying worlds, we have to look at the psychological friction of his early life.
It wasn't just that he was poor. It was the specific, agonizing way he was kept in poverty by his foster father, John Allan.
Yeah, that relationship is the absolute crucible of Poe's psychological development, isn't it?
It really is. So, John Allan was a tremendously wealthy Scottish merchant living in Richmond, Virginia.
And Poe's biological parents were traveling actors.
Right. Yes, which was a highly marginalized profession at the time. They either died or abandoned him by the time he was 2, so the Allans took him in.
They gave him their name, right?
Edgar Allan Poe.
They did. And they moved into this massive Richmond mansion called Moldavia. They even took him to England and Scotland for 5 years.
Oh, wow. So he got the full elite experience.
Absolutely. He received a classical education, studying Latin and French at these incredibly elite boarding schools.
So he's raised with the absolute expectation of being a Southern aristocrat. He has the education, the tastes, the social circle of the elite.
But our sources highlight this massive permanent caveat. John Allan never legally adopted him.
Wait, really? Never?
Never. And that lack of legal adoption wasn't just like a paperwork oversight. It was a deliberate mechanism of control.
I mean, that sounds incredibly manipulative.
It was. John Allan kept Poe in a constant state of financial dependency and profound emotional insecurity.
So it created a situation where Poe felt he was inherently part of the upper class, but was constantly reminded he was basically a charity case. Exactly, a charity case who could be discarded at any moment.
Which comes to a catastrophic head when Poe goes to the University of Virginia in 1826.
Oh, the UVA disaster.
Yeah, if you've ever been to college and struggled to pay for textbooks, you will feel this in your bones.
Because Poe arrives at this highly elite institution, right? He's surrounded by the sons of vastly wealthy plantation owners.
And he needs to maintain the lifestyle of a gentleman to fit in. But John Allan deliberately shortchanges him.
Massively shortchanges him. The biographies detail how Allan provided him with only a fraction of the money actually required for basic tuition.
Let alone room, board, and simple things like firewood.
Right. Allen's exact motivations for underfunding him are still debated by historians, but the result was immediate.
Poe tries to bridge the gap between his aristocratic identity and his empty wallet by turning to gambling.
Which, to be fair, was incredibly common in the culture of 19th century Southern gentlemen.
But for Poe, it was an act of sheer desperation, and it spectacularly backfired.
He accumulated massive debts, and when the creditors came calling, John Allan absolutely refused to pay a single cent.
Forcing Poe to drop out in total disgrace after less than a year.
This is where your Silicon Valley founder analogy really solidifies. The funding is pulled, the reputation is torched.
And Poe has to figure out how to survive. He can't go back to the mansion in Richmond.
So what does he do? In a move that I think completely defies the fragile poet stereotype, he enlists in the United States Army.
But he does it under a fake name, right? Edgar A. Perry.
Yeah. He was hiding from his creditors, certainly, but he was also hiding from the sheer social humiliation of his situation.
The son of Moldavia was now a common foot soldier.
But what's crucial to understand here, especially looking at Hayes's biographical research, is that Poe didn't just survive the military.
He actually excelled at it, didn't he?
He did. He was promoted to sergeant major.
Wait, really? Isn't that a pretty high rank?
It was the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could possibly achieve at the time.
Wow. That completely contradicts the myth of the erratic, drunken bohemian. He clearly had an immense capacity for discipline and rigorous work.
Exactly. Though I see it slightly differently, based on the sources. I think his military success actually highlights his fatal flaw.
Which is what? His obsession with status.
Yes. He achieves sergeant major, realizes he has hit the absolute ceiling for an enlisted man, and decides he must be an officer.
Ah, of course. So after Francis Allan, his foster mother and his only buffer between him and John Allan dies, they have a brief reconciliation.
And Poe gets an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Because he wanted the prestige of an officer's commission.
Right. But the cycle of financial manipulation just immediately repeated itself.
Because while Poe is at West Point, John Allan remarries.
And his new wife soon gives birth to a legitimate son, an actual biological heir to the Allan fortune.
And the door slams shut forever.
It's slammed shut and it's bolted. John Allan cuts off all communication. He stops sending any allowance.
And to be an officer cadet at West Point in that era, you needed a private income, right?
You did. You had to purchase your own uniforms, textbooks, basic supplies. Poe runs the numbers and realizes he literally cannot afford to stay.
But he can't just hand in his resignation either. The military rules at the time required his legal guardian's permission to resign.
And John Allan completely ignored his letters. So Poe is trapped.
And what he does next is just a masterclass in calculated rebellion.
He orchestrates his own court-martial.
That is so wild to me. The records from West Point are fascinating on this.
He didn't just slack off. He systematically broke the rules required to force an expulsion.
Yeah, he boycotted his classes, he stopped showing up for guard duty, he refused to attend chapel.
He racked up dozens of deliberate offenses in a matter of weeks.
Until the military had absolutely no choice but to formally expel him. It's a breathtaking level of audacity.
He actively burns down his only remaining bridge to a stable, respectable life.
Just so he can escape and try to make a living as a writer in a market that was fundamentally hostile to writers.
And the texts point out that this violent oscillation between high society proximity and abject, literal starvation created a permanent chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, he carried himself like a displaced king, but the publishing industry treated him like a peasant.
Which transitions us perfectly into understanding the actual battlefield he stepped onto when he left West Point.
Right, because if you are a freelance writer today, or an independent creator trying to monetize your work, the landscape Poe faced will sound horrifyingly familiar.
Just dialed up to 11, we really have to look at the publishing market of the 1830s and 40s.
Because Poe didn't want to be a horror writer initially. He wanted to be a respected highbrow poet.
He absolutely did. His first publication in 1827 was a slim volume called Tamerlane and Other Poems.
But the structural economics of the American literary market made it virtually impossible to survive as a poet. Or even a novelist.
The primary culprit was the complete lack of international copyright law.
This is the part of the research that totally blew my mind. Explain how this copyright vacuum actually functioned.
Well, it was essentially state-sanctioned piracy.
Completely legal piracy.
Yes. Major American publishing houses, like Harper & Brothers, realized they were under no legal obligation to pay royalties to foreign authors.
So instead of taking a financial risk by paying in advance to an unknown American writer like Poe.
They would simply wait for the newest novel by British literary giants like Charles Dickens or Walter Scott or Lord Byron to arrive on a ship from London.
And they would just immediately typeset the book, print thousands of copies, and keep 100% of the profits. It's like trying to sell your indie film to a theater, but the theater is legally allowed to just pirate blockbuster Marvel movies and screen them for free.
And keep all the ticket sales. Why on earth would they ever pay you?
You cannot compete with free guaranteed bestsellers.
You cannot. And Poe realized this very quickly. The traditional book market was close to him.
So out of sheer survival instinct, he pivoted to the only sector of the industry that actually needed constant, fresh, uniquely American content.
Periodicals, newspapers and magazines.
The 19th century equivalent of the internet. It was a booming, chaotic, high-volume industry.
Exactly. But it was also low-paying and incredibly ephemeral. You wrote a story, it was published, and a week later it was forgotten.
So Poe had to adapt his highly sophisticated literary ambitions to fit this disposable medium.
He started entering literary contests sponsored by newspapers just to get cash in hand.
Right. He famously won a $50 prize from the Baltimore Saturday Visitor for his story, MS Script Found in a Bottle.
And later won $100 for the Gold Bug.
But a $50 prize here and there does not provide a stable living, especially when you are supporting your Aunt Maria Clem and your chronically ill wife, Virginia.
Which is where Jonathan Hartman's research on the marketing of Edgar Allan Poe becomes so critical.
Because Poe wasn't just submitting stories and hoping for the best. He became what he himself called a diddler.
I love that term. Diddling is a fantastic 19th century word that Poe actually wrote an entire satirical essay about.
It basically means hustling, scamming, or manipulating the system to your advantage, right?
Precisely. Hartman's research reveals that Poe was essentially a pioneer of modern marketing manipulation.
Because he couldn't rely on massive book advances, he had to squeeze every single penny out of his existing work.
And he had to relentlessly manufacture his own fame.
Let's dig into the mechanics of this hustle, because it is brilliant. First off, he was the absolute king of recycling content.
He really was. He would sell a poem to a magazine in Philadelphia, wait a few months, change the title slightly,
And sell the exact same poem to a magazine in New York.
and then maybe expand it slightly and sell it in Richmond. He was constantly self-plagiarizing just to generate multiple paychecks from a single piece of work.
Which was incredibly risky, given how incestuous the publishing world was, but he really had no other choice.
However, his true genius wasn't in recycling content. It was in how he manipulated public attention.
He intuitively understood what we now call the attention economy.
If you look at his very first published critical essay titled Letter to Be, he doesn't just humbly introduce his theories on poetry.
No, he immediately starts throwing punches at massive, internationally revered British poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Right. He's a 20-something kid with one self-published pamphlet to his name, and he's publicly attacking the titans of English literature.
It was a highly calculated public relations stunt.
By placing his own name in the same sentence as Wordsworth, and by adopting this tone of intellectual superiority, he was artificially elevating his own status.
He knew that attacking beloved figures would outrage the literary establishment.
And outrage generates letters to the editor. It generates response essays. It generates buzz.
It is the exact same playbook used today by a small, unknown podcaster or YouTuber who makes a wildly aggressive video titled, "Why Mr. Beast is Completely Wrong."
They don't actually care about proving the larger creator wrong.
No, they just want to siphon off some of that search traffic and algorithm juice. Poe was manufacturing controversy to get eyeballs on his name.
And that instinct for manufactured controversy reaches its absolute zenith with an essay he published in 1846 called The Philosophy of Composition.
Yes, let's break this down because this is my absolute favorite part of the research.
It is perhaps the greatest piece of literary marketing of the 19th century.
To set the context for you listening, in 1845, Poe publishes his poem, The Raven, and it goes massively viral.
It is reprinted in newspapers across the country. Kids are literally following him down the street, flapping their arms.
He becomes famous practically overnight, but because of those terrible copyright structures we talked about, fame didn't equal wealth.
Right. He was paid a flat fee, something like $9 or $15 for the initial publication of The Raven.
And he didn't see a single dime from all those widespread reprints.
He had achieved maximum cultural penetration, but his bank account was still empty.
So to capitalize on the hype And to keep his name in the press so he could sell his upcoming collections of stories and essays, he writes The Philosophy of Composition.
In this essay, Poe claims to pull back the curtain and reveal to the reader the exact step-by-step process of how he wrote his famous poem.
And he completely shatters the romantic ideal in the process, doesn't he?
He does. The prevailing idea at the time, championed by guys like Wordsworth, was that poetry was a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion.
The poet wanders through nature, gets struck by divine inspiration, and frantically writes down a masterpiece.
But Poe explicitly mocks that idea. In the essay, he insists that his writing process is cold, rigid, and entirely mathematical.
He tells the reader that he didn't rely on inspiration at all.
He claims he started by calculating the optimal length for a poem to sustain a specific emotional effect, deciding on exactly 100 lines.
Then he decided the most universally melancholy topic was the death of a beautiful woman.
He even claims he engineered the refrain nevermore, specifically because the long O and the rolling R sounds are phonetically the most sonorous and mournful letters in the alphabet.
So he presents himself not as a tortured artist, but as a literary engineer, assembling this psychological machine designed to perfectly manipulate the reader's nervous system.
It's wild. What do you compare that to today?
I compare this to a modern movie director doing an incredibly detailed DVD commentary track, or a viral creator posting a "how I hacked the algorithm to make this video" tutorial.
That's a great analogy. The academic sources argue that this entire essay is essentially a massive, highly sophisticated piece of native advertising.
It's a brilliant reading of the text. By openly displaying what he called the wheels and pinions and the red paint of his literary theater, he was daring the public to look at his machinery.
He trusted that the reading public would be so fascinated by his audacity and so intrigued by his claim that he could mathematically program their emotions.
That they would rush out to buy his books just to see if his psychological hacking actually worked on them.
He's explicitly telling you, I am manipulating you. And his confidence is so charismatic that you happily hand him your money anyway.
It's the ultimate diddle. But here's the friction, and this brings us to the actual reception of his work. Not everyone found this hustle charming.
Far from it. His aggressive self-promotion, combined with the bizarre, often gruesome nature of his stories, made him a massive target for the established literary elite.
Which brings us to the intense, century-long debate over his actual writing style. Because that debate was truly vicious.
It was. The rhetorical sources we're examining show that the literary establishment of his day, and for many decades after his death, fundamentally rejected Poe not just as a person, but as a craftsman.
The quotes from these heavyweights are brutal. You have Ralph Waldo Emerson, arguably the most respected intellectual in America at the time,
Completely dismissing Poe as nothing more than the Jingle Man, implying his poetry was just cheap, rhythmic nursery rhymes.
and Henry James, the master of the psychological novel, stated publicly that taking Poe's writing seriously was the mark of a decidedly primitive stage of reflection.
He's basically calling Poe's entire fan base intellectually stunted.
And then you have Mark Twain famously declaring that Poe's prose was completely unreadable.
For a long time, the academic consensus aligned with Twain and James.
The general feeling was that Poe might have possessed a dark, interesting imagination for plotting a spooky story, but on a technical level, he was just a clumsy, melodramatic hack.
Critics accused his prose of being overly emotional, highly repetitive, and hopelessly addicted to hyperbole and exclamation points.
They viewed his erratic sentence structures as proof of his own mental instability, or just laziness.
But I love when modern scholarship completely flips the script on conventional wisdom.
Me too. And the dense rhetorical analyses in our source stack argue that these legendary critics completely missed the boat.
They didn't understand what Poe was actually doing at a structural level.
The rhetorical scholars argue that Poe didn't have one singular sloppy Poe style, right?
Exactly. It's a massive misconception that he only knew how to write in breathless, hyper-emotional bursts.
Instead, they demonstrate that Poe was a highly disciplined linguistic chameleon.
He deliberately adapted and tailored his grammatical syntax to perfectly mirror the psychological state of whichever specific narrator he was inventing for a given story.
Okay, we need to dive deep into this because the sources use some incredibly heavy rhetorical terminology to prove this point. Walk us through how he actually manipulated his grammar.
The research categorizes his prose into several distinct styles. Let's look at the most famous one, the arabesque style.
This is the style you encounter in his iconic psychological horror tales, like The Telltale Heart or The Fall of the House of Usher, right?
Yes. When critics like Henry James read these stories, they pointed to the incredibly repetitive phrasing, a rhetorical device known as anaphora, and the fragmented, breathless syntax as evidence of bad writing.
Right. If we look at the opening lines of The Telltale Heart, true. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad?
It's full of dashes, stutters, and
If
repetitions.
you submitted that in a Creative Writing 101 class, the professor would cover it in red ink.
But the rhetorical scholars point out that this isn't Poe being a bad writer. It's Poe executing a perfectly crafted, deliberate simulation of a schizophrenic or deeply paranoid mind.
Because the narrator in The Telltale Heart is actively suffering a psychotic break.
Exactly. If the grammar in that story were perfectly balanced, calm, and logically structured, it would completely betray the reality of the character.
The erratic, repetitive style is the character. The text itself is having a panic attack.
It's like method acting, but with grammar. He's inhabiting the syntax of a madman.
That becomes incredibly obvious when you contrast it with another style the sources identify, the analytical style.
Right. When Poe essentially invented the modern detective genre with his story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, he needed his protagonist, C. Auguste Dupin, to sound entirely different from the raving murderer in The Telltale Heart.
Dupin is a creature of pure, cold logic, so Poe deploys the analytical style.
The sentences in the Dupin stories are vastly longer. They use complex, balanced clauses. They are completely devoid of exclamation points and hyperbole.
The rhetoric is structured like a formal mathematical proof or a legal brief. He sounds like an 18th century Enlightenment philosopher.
Entirely governed by reason. And then there's a third style mentioned, the Kurtz style, which employs a device called brachalogia.
Brachalogia, that refers to extremely short, snappy, almost unnaturally abbreviated sentence, right?
Yes. Poe deployed this style primarily in his satirical and comedic pieces, which, surprisingly, make up a large portion of his body of work.
He used the Kurtz style specifically when he was parodying the breathless, sensationalist, lowbrow journalism of the very magazines he was competing against.
He was mocking the media of his day by mimicking their simplistic, punchy sentence structures.
Okay, I follow the rhetorical breakdown, and it makes for a great academic paper. But I have to push back a little here on behalf of the skeptical listener.
Sure, what's the pushback?
Isn't it incredibly convenient for literary critics today to just look back and say, oh, the writing isn't erratic because he was rushing to meet a deadline while drinking. The writing is erratic because the character is erratic, so it's actually secret genius.
That is the exact counter-argument leveled by his detractors.
Because how do we actually know? Poe wasn't just being a sloppy, overworked magazine writer trying to hit a word count to buy dinner.
It's a very fair question to ask of any prolific commercial writer. But the definitive proof that this stylistic manipulation was deliberate and highly conscious lies in a completely different sector of his writing.
His nonfiction literary reviews.
Ah, the Tomahawk Man, yes.
We have to remember that for most of his career, Poe wasn't primarily known as a fiction writer.
He was known as a fearsome literary critic and magazine editor. He reviewed hundreds of books by other authors.
And in those reviews, he was terrifyingly strict, wasn't he?
He was mathematically precise about language. He would dedicate pages to dismantling another author's work over a misused semicolon or a dangling modifier.
Or a slight miscalculation in the metrical stress of a poem's rhythm.
He was so ruthless and technically demanding that he earned the nickname the Tomahawk Man of American letters.
He was the ultimate grammar enforcer of the 19th century.
Some scholars even refer to him as an Aristotle of the 19th century because of his obsession with the absolute rules of composition.
So the logical conclusion is this. A man who is that deeply pathologically obsessed with linguistic rules.
A man who writes dense essays analyzing the exact syllable stress in a single line of poetry.
Does not accidentally break basic grammatical rules in his own fiction.
Exactly. When he fragments a sentence or repeats a phrase ad nauseum, he is breaking the rules on purpose for a calculated psychological effect.
The erratic style is a mask he meticulously carved and chose to wear for that specific performance.
That reframing completely changes how you have to read him.
It really does. Once you realize that the style is a highly controlled mask, crafted by a guy who actually knows exactly what he's doing down to the syllable, it entirely changes how we must view the horrifying recurring themes he was so obsessed with.
He wasn't just vomiting his trauma onto the page, he was architecting it.
Which brings us to our final major area of the research, the architecture of dread. We need to look at the phenomenological analysis of his themes.
specifically his themes of women, graves, and a godless universe.
Phenomenology, in this context, is the study of how an author constructs the fundamental experience of reality and consciousness for the reader.
And when we look at the phenomenological sources in our stack, we see a writer who is repeatedly, almost obsessively, constructing a reality defined by profound, inescapable loss.
The most famous example, of course, is his own infamous declaration in The Philosophy of Composition, that the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world.
And you see this specific trope everywhere in his bibliography.
The poem Annabel, The Raven, the stories like Ligeia, Berenice, The Fall of the House of Usher.
There is almost always a beautiful, ethereal, impossibly perfect woman who wastes away and dies, leaving a male narrator behind.
Now, the easy high school English class explanation for this is always purely biographical.
Right. The teacher says, well, his biological mother died of tuberculosis, his beloved foster mother Frances died, and his young wife Virginia died of tuberculosis.
So, of course, he uses his writing as a diary to process his grief over dying women.
And while that biographical trauma is undeniably the fuel for his obsession, the phenomenological scholars argue that reducing it to a diary entry ignores the philosophical depth of what he's actually doing.
The sources suggest there's something much more subversive happening. They point out that Poe is taking a very specific, deeply ingrained Western literary tradition and completely inverting it.
Are we talking about the Dante connection here? Because this blew my mind when I read it.
Yes, the comparison to Dante Alighieri is crucial. Think about Dante's Divine Comedy.
In that epic, the death of Dante's beloved Beatrice is the catalyst for his entire spiritual awakening.
Her death forces him to travel through hell and purgatory, and ultimately, she is the spiritual guide who leads him into heaven to experience the beatific vision, the presence of God.
So, in the classical Western tradition, a woman's death is a tragic but ultimately redemptive vehicle that leads the male protagonist to spiritual salvation and eternal truth.
But in Poe's universe, that machinery is completely broken. There is no spiritual salvation waiting at the end of the grieving process.
None whatsoever. Unlike Dante, Poe offers absolutely zero redemption.
When a woman dies in a Poe story, she doesn't guide the narrator to paradise. She doesn't impart divine wisdom.
Instead, she usually comes back as a terrifying physical corpse like in Ligeia or The Fall of the House of Usher.
Or her absence leaves the narrator in a state of permanent, crushing, inescapable psychological torment, as in The Raven.
The speaker in The Raven asks the bird if he will ever be reunited with Lenore in heaven, and the bird's answer is a definitive, crushing nevermore.
His poems and tales aren't about finding meaning in loss. They are models of the pure, unmitigated, meaningless pain of loss.
There is no philosophical comfort. There is no silver lining. It is an incredibly bleak vision of reality.
It points to a much broader existential dread that saturates all of his work. The phenomenological sources look closely at his famous story, The Mask of the Red Death, to illustrate this point.
Let's set the scene for the listener, because it's a brilliant story. You have Prince Prospero, a wealthy, arrogant nobleman
Who locks himself and 1,000 of his wealthy friends inside a fortified abbey to escape a devastating, gruesome plague that is ravaging the countryside, the Red Death.
They literally weld the doors shut. They throw a massive, decadent masquerade ball in these bizarre, color-coded rooms, completely ignoring the suffering of the poor outside.
But eventually, a mysterious figure in a bloody shroud appears at the party. The plague has gotten inside, and it systematically kills every single person in the abbey.
On a surface level, it's a terrifying Gothic horror story about a disease.
But the academic analysis suggests this story is actually Poe's most explicit description of a completely godless universe.
Think about the mechanics of the story. There is a massive black ebony clock in the final room that chimes every hour,
forcing the revelers to stop and acknowledge the passing of time.
And when everyone is dead, the final line of the story is essentially that darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
Exactly. There is no moral judgment happening in that story. The Red Death doesn't care that Prospero is arrogant.
But it also wouldn't have cared if you were a saint. It doesn't care if you are rich or poor.
Humans, in Poe's phenomenological reality, are just biological entities. We're fragile bags of meat, entirely at the mercy of completely indifferent cosmic forces and the relentless mechanical ticking of the clock.
It's an incredibly modern, almost nihilistic worldview. He is writing about existential absurdity and a silent universe decades before philosophers like Nietzsche or Sartre popularized those ideas.
And this absolute lack of a safety net in the universe connects directly to another one of his major recurring obsessions, the theme of premature burial.
It is arguably his most visceral theme. He wrote numerous stories centered around the terror of waking up nailed inside a coffin.
You have the premature burial, the cask of Amontillado, the fall of the House of Usher.
Now, to give some historical context, the 19th century did have a genuine widespread cultural phobia about being buried alive.
Right, medical science was still quite primitive regarding the exact definition of death. People occasionally did fall into comas and wake up in morgues or graves.
There were even patents for safety coffins with bells attached to strings in case you woke up underground.
So he was definitely tapping into a current pop culture fear. But the sources we're reading suggest something much more personal and metaphorical was driving his obsession with this specific trope.
It raises a vital question about how Poe actually viewed his own day-to-day existence.
The phenomenological texts, combined with Hartman's research on his marketing struggles, suggest that being buried alive wasn't just a spooky plot device.
It was the perfect, terrifying metaphor for Poe's own life and career.
Elaborate on that, because that is a profound connection.
Think about the psychological profile we built earlier. Here is a man who possessed a classical education, who deeply believed he was a transcendent genius, a true intellectual aristocrat.
Yet, what was his actual reality?
He was trapped, metaphorically buried alive, in the low-paying, suffocating, endless grind of periodical journalism.
He was trapped by endless debts. He was trapped in small, rented rooms, watching his wife slowly suffocate from tuberculosis.
He was trapped in a hyper-capitalist publishing society that fundamentally didn't value his high art unless he disguised it as a cheap, quick thrill to sell magazines.
He is a genius, screaming from inside the coffin of his own miserable circumstances.
And the only way the outside world can hear him is if he writes a story about someone screaming inside a literal coffin.
That genuinely gives me chills. It reframes his entire bibliography. He isn't writing horror just to scare people.
He's writing horror because it is the only accurate reflection of his internal reality.
And that realization is exactly what drove his revolutionary approach to literature itself. This is perhaps his greatest legacy.
For centuries before Poe, the standard, unchallenged paradigm for literature was that it must fulfill two duties. It must instruct and delight.
It had to be entertaining, but its primary purpose was to teach a moral lesson, to improve the reader's character, to point toward a divine truth.
The didactic tradition. Every story needed a clear moral at the end.
Exactly. But Poe looked at his own life, and he looked at the indifferent universe he perceived, and he completely shattered that paradigm.
He explicitly stated in his critical essays that a poem or a tale has absolutely no obligation to teach a moral truth.
In fact, he fiercely attacked the desire to preach a moral lesson, famously calling it the heresy of the didactic.
For Poe, the only immediate justifiable object of art was pleasure, and achieving a singular, incredibly powerful unity of effect on the reader's emotions.
Which makes perfect logical sense given everything we've discussed. If the universe is godless, if there is no grand moral order protecting the innocent,
and if your own life is a series of brutal, meaningless tragedies,
then trying to write neat little moralizing fables is not just pointless, it's intellectually dishonest.
the only honest thing you can do as an artist is to make the reader feel something as deeply and intensely as possible, even if that feeling is absolute, unadulterated terror.
He wanted to bypass the intellect and directly manipulate the reader's nervous system. He wanted to engineer an emotional response.
And despite the critics of his day, he accomplished that goal better and more enduringly than almost anyone else in his generation.
So bringing all of this together, if you've been listening, I hope you see how completely we've had to reshape the narrative today.
We have stripped away that cheap, two-dimensional Halloween costume version of Edgar Allan Poe.
We've gone past the caricature of the drunk with the raven. We've seen the orphan battling lifelong poverty and the relentless trauma of tuberculosis.
We've seen the genius marketer, the shameless diddler who manipulated the magazine industry, hacked the attention economy with fake controversies.
And practically invented native advertising with behind-the-scenes essays.
We've analyzed the deeply misunderstood linguist, a man who wasn't just wildly typing away in a frenzy, but a strict grammarian who meticulously tailored his syntax to perfectly match the erratic pulse of madness.
And we've seen the dark phenomenologist, a philosopher staring into a godless mechanical abyss and creating an entirely new kind of art out of pure dread.
It is a remarkable, cohesive synthesis of a deeply fractured life.
And what I think is most important for you, the listener, to take away is that Poe's influence isn't just historical. It is actively shaping the media we consume right now.
Every time you read a modern psychological thriller with a deeply unreliable narrator who makes you question the very fabric of reality,
Or every time you see a digital creator generating controversial buzz to hack an algorithm and force you to look at their product.
you are living in the exact commercial and psychological world that Edgar Allan Poe invented out of pure, unadulterated desperation.
He didn't just write scary stories. He built the actual blueprint for modern commercial literature and media manipulation.
He absolutely did. He is the patron saint of the hustle.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up.
We've talked extensively today about how Poe spent his entire life inventing manipulative narrators wearing these highly deliberate linguistic masks.
And carefully crafting a public persona of the doomed mad genius, specifically to sell magazines and survive a hostile market.
But here's the danger of being that good at marketing. If you spend your entire life wearing a mask, does it eventually become your face?
Did his deliberate, calculated creation of this tragic, unreliable, haunted character bleed so deeply into reality and into the cultural memory that the real Edgar Allan Poe is forever lost to us?
The disciplined soldier, the brilliant editor, the desperate husband trying to save his family.
Is the real human being permanently entombed alive behind the very marble statue, the very marketing persona that he built to survive?
Think about that next time you see a raven.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.